Waiting. It's something that we all have to do, and I think most people can agree they hate having to do it. Despite that though, waiting is a very prominent part of games, and more specifically for this video, the Mario series features a lot of waiting throughout its many titles. Whether it be waiting on a moving platform, waiting for an autoscroll, waiting for Nintendo to finally announce Mario Odyssey 2, waiting is an important part of the series. But if waiting is something that most of us hate doing, then why is it in these games? Yes, autoscroll levels are very often seen as some of the worst in any given game. Take my story mode level ranking video for example, most autoscrollers placed pretty low on the list, however not all of them did. It is possible to make a level that prominently features waiting interesting. The question is, how do you do that? Today, I want to try to answer that question and say how you could implement waiting into your Mario Maker 2 levels while still keeping it interesting and engaging. I guess you could sort of think of this as a tips and tricks video, which would make this my first one in over a year. So if you do enjoy this look at how the Mario series uses waiting in its levels, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so I know to make more videos like this. But with that said, I think it's time we jump right into how to make waiting interesting in Super Mario Maker 2. First off, I want to more specifically specify what I mean exactly by having the player wait. This video was originally going to be purely based on the autoscroll feature, though I felt like it would be a lot more interesting to look at waiting in levels as a whole, because there are many other instances where players would have to wait without having to have an autoscroll. Pretty much, if the player cannot directly progress the level without something based on a timer occurring, then to me, they're waiting for that timer to complete. The autoscroll timer is of course how long until it reaches the end of a level. That one is pretty self-explanatory. Looking at moving platforms, players may have to wait on them to reach the end of a track in order to progress. For a less obvious one, sometimes players will be put into a room where they have to survive until a timer gives them some sort of key to escape. That would be another example of waiting as they're waiting for that timer. And again, those are just examples. There are many more types of waiting, but I think you all get the picture by now. So with that said, how do we make these waiting situations interesting? Well, my first tip is to not have them. Okay, alright, what I mean is, don't have them if they aren't necessary. Most of the time, autoscroll levels feel terrible to play because they don't feel like they needed to have the slow scroll. Most people want to actually play the game, and if you're like me, you enjoy trying to beat levels quickly. That means that I often find myself just running against the autoscroll because I'm simply moving faster than it. Try to design your level with it being an autoscroller in mind. If you can genuinely picture your level working perfectly fine without an autoscroll, then it probably shouldn't have one and more people would enjoy it that way. I can't tell you how many autoscroll levels I've played where the entire time I'm just thinking to myself, this would be a pretty good level if it didn't have autoscroll. By definition, the autoscroll is automatic, meaning the player has zero control over how fast it goes, which can be very annoying if it's going super slowly. This isn't too much of a problem with moving platform levels since those are obviously the focus, so it clearly wouldn't work without the waiting. To better illustrate my point here, I want to take a look at a specific level in the story mode, level 23, Above the Clouds, Beyond the Vines. The idea behind this level is simple. Mario has to climb up a ton of vines in a vertical sub-area. However, thwomps and lakitus all get in the way to make this level a bit more difficult. The idea behind this is pretty solid, but it all falls apart because they decided to make it an autoscroller, and not only that, a slow autoscroller. This causes a myriad of problems. For one, it makes this level incredibly tedious to go through. It takes forever for the screen to scroll where you need it to, which means there are several large gaps in the level where you just do nothing. On top of that, the scroll also makes it impossible to see some of the obstacles before the player gets hit due to the very little room at the top of the screen. That's not really related to waiting per se, but hey, this is the only video I got to talk about autoscrollers, so I might as well bring it up. So what adding the autoscroll leaves us with is a super boring, uninteresting stage that once had a somewhat decent idea at its core. If I were to guess, they likely added the autoscroll so that if you fell, you would die instead of just going to the bottom of the sub area. But that's stupid because anyone with more brain cells than a Pokemon fan would know to never let go of the vine. So this level is a perfect example of including autoscrolling when it isn't necessary. So whenever you want to make a level using autoscroll, be sure to ask yourself, do I really need to? But let's say the answer to that question is yes, you do need to make your level an autoscroller or have some other form of waiting. What do you do then? Well, one thing you could do is keep it short. Okay, I know it looks like I'm just trying to get rid of waiting instead of giving tips, but I promise this line of thinking makes sense. If you as the player have to wait for something, you probably don't want to have to wait for too long. The pace of any level you make is very important in how people perceive it after the fact. Even if your level with an autoscroller is technically shorter than a level without one, the longer level may feel less tedious because of the control the player had on the pace. The safest thing you can do is make the waiting segments of your level short while still showing off what you wanted to do within them. Let's take a look at an example of waiting in a boss room to illustrate this point. This is taken from one of my levels, and in the room, Mario needs to use the dry bone shell, dry bones for smash, to avoid the thwomps caves above him a few times before a timer at the left expires and Mario can leave. The point of this room was to showcase the dry bone shell's crumble mechanic in a unique scenario, so for me, I just wanted to show off this neat little ability and then move on. So my timer here, to me, is just long enough to show off that mechanic and give the player a mini challenge, but it's not too long to where the player gets bored of the idea. This timer could be very easily adjusted to be much longer, which takes this once somewhat interesting mechanic showcase into a long, drawn out, and boring boss fight. So it is very important to playtest your levels to find the perfect timer length, because you're on a very thin line between making your level fun or making the player loathe it. Another danger that comes from a long and slow autoscroller / waiting segment is the fact that the player may have to do it more than once. There is no worse feeling than dying like 3/4 of a way through an autoscroll level and having to start it all over again. Because now, not only are you waiting, but you're waiting through stuff you have already been through. This is the main problem with having a long autoscroller in my opinion, because I promise you, no one is going to want to replay through your autoscroll level if they have already been playing it for like 3 minutes. So if you're going to do a longer autoscroll or moving platform level, make sure there are plenty of checkpoints. TDM is the #1 thing that you want to avoid when making a level with waiting, so be sure that if the player does happen to die, they're not going to automatically boo and skip the level. Okay, well, people are going to do that anyway regardless of autoscroll, but still do your best. But what about the actual content within the autoscroller? How do we make that exciting? This is where we can really start delving into some more specific tips, and my first one here is to distract the player from the fact that they are even waiting at all. Now this may seem hard to apply to autoscroll levels, but as we've been talking about, that's not the only type of waiting seen in Mario Maker levels. One common type of waiting is for a P-switch to expire. The P-switch is a built-in timer that the creator of a level can't control since it was programmed by the game's developers, but its mechanics make it a really important item in Mario Maker. Primarily, it's able to turn coins into bricks and vice versa, along with swapping the state of P-switch blocks. Due to that unique gimmick, it's used fairly often in levels. However, since the creator can't end the P-switch's effects whenever they want, they'll very often block the player from progressing in a level until it expires. Most players by now understand the need for this, as P-switches going on for longer than planned can easily break levels, but there are ways around forcing the player to just sit there and do nothing. Taking another quick example from one of my levels, Boomerang in the Underground, the first section ends by hitting a P-switch, and once the player leaves that room, they can't go into the next one until after the timer expires. Instead of just putting a wall of P-switch blocks though, what I did was make this room the room with the checkpoint, giving the player something to grab in the meantime, and I also filled it with coin blocks. That way the player gets distracted from the P-switch timer and hits these blocks for extra coins instead. By the time they're done with those, the P-switch will be as well, making the wait not really feel like it was there at all. Obviously not every player is going to want to grab these coins, but their opinion doesn't matter because they stack no paper like me. Okay, but back to the point, a simple distraction like this can go a long way in making these small unavoidable waiting sections in your level feel a lot less tedious. Never make it feel like your player has absolutely nothing to do, because that's when they're going to start getting bored. One thing you could do is let the player control how much they have to wait. Now I know that may seem stupid, I mean if you can speed it up, are you really waiting at all? I would argue in some cases yes, so I think this tip still applies. Take a moving platform level for example. Maybe you could let the player jump off the platform early to move ahead without it. The player would still be waiting on the platform for most of the level, but they have the option to go a bit quicker if they want to, even if it is a bit difficult. Maybe in an autoscroller you could place hidden pipes that can act as shortcuts to bring you ahead in the level. If you do that though, make sure the method of finding them is actually logical. No one wants to see another hidden block tower into a secret. One mainline Mario level that I think does a really good job at this controlling the wait time idea is 5-4 from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. The main gimmick of this level is this moving raft that you may notice has a few numbers on the side. As enemies start to land on the platform though, the number begins to reach 5, and once it does, the platform will completely stop in its tracks. The whole idea is based around trying to clear the platform so you don't have to get stuck in place, which makes it one of my personal favorites in the game. It doesn't feel like it drags on for too long because anytime the platform stops, you know as the player that you could have prevented that. Additionally, if you manage to get through the level without it stopping a single time, then you're going to feel pretty good since you didn't have to wait as long as the losers who got swarmed by mini Goombas. Oh, and this level also features my favorite speedrun skip in the game, where you parkour over the entire level with a propeller suit. This was definitely not intentional, and it's also not really that relevant, but I think it would have been wrong of me not to include it. I mean, how can you not think this is just super cool? Now yes, an element like that doesn't exactly exist in Mario Maker 2, but there are ways to let the player speed up a level without it. Another important step to ensure that an autoscroller is not boring is to make sure it isn't repetitive. Now that goes for pretty much every level type. I'm sure no one wants to do the exact same task over and over again. Unless you're one of those maniacs that enjoy those 200 pixel perfect jump precision levels. Wow, I love zooming in on Mario's toe to make sure it's on the right pixel. Make sure that you're actually building on the challenge of your level as you go. If the player is doing different things as they continue on, then it'll go a long way in making the level feel a little bit less slow. I mean, you're already risking the level feeling repetitive if the player dies at any point, so I think you're going to want to avoid the possibility of making them even more annoyed as much as possible. I can't really think of any good examples to show for this one because most autoscroll levels generally build on their concept as they go. The closest thing I could find was level 66 of the story mode, Parabeetle Transfer. For pretty much the entire level, you could just spam jump on top of the Parabeetle without much risk of ever dying. On top of that, this is probably the slowest level in the entire game, making it super boring. They definitely should have added a few more obstacles here to keep it a little bit more interesting, though in all honesty, I also wish they made it a bit shorter too. Do not ever make a nighttime underwater autoscroll level. Nighttime underwater is bad enough. You do not need to let it autoscroll too. I somehow haven't seen a level like this yet, and I do not want to see it now. Okay, I don't really know how to end this segment. This horrific idea just sort of popped into my head, so, yeah. But the single most important thing for making a level with auto-scrolling, moving platforms, or any sort of waiting is to make sure the player is never doing absolutely nothing. If at any point in your level there is a prolonged period of time where all the player can do is sit still and wait for the level to let them keep moving, then they're going to dislike the level. One simple thing you can do is just put obstacles in your level. This may seem like a super obvious thing because what's the point of having a level if there's no obstacles? Well, believe it or not, Nintendo themselves are guilty of making a level like this. Number 21 in Mario Maker 2 Story Mode, Snake Blocks in the Sky, is what I believe to be the worst level in the story mode. All you do in this level is wait for a snake block to slowly make its way over to the flagpole. There is absolutely nothing that can damage Mario here, meaning you feel every single second slowly scrape by until you're finally able to finish the level. You need to have something stand in Mario's way of reaching the goal, because otherwise it's just going to end up like this level where the player feels absolutely nothing but boredom the entire time. Now, what obstacles you choose for the level is also important. If it's just a Goomba, for example, sure, it might give the player a little bit of a fright, but as soon as they jump on it, it's right back to nothing. The Angry Sun or Lakitu can work pretty well, though once again, if they aren't attacking, it can feel a bit dry. Since players will generally be moving through autoscrollers slower than normal levels, having a more densely packed level might make the most sense. The obstacles don't have to be things that are directly damaging to Mario either. Let's take a look at a level that I think does this pretty well in the story mode, On-Off Rail Switch. Now, you may notice that there are plenty of points here where the player is just standing still, but in all of those segments, he's given a preview of what's ahead, which means Mario has to remain on his toes even if the obstacle is still a second or two away. The waits between obstacles aren't very long either, so it doesn't feel like it's slowing down. If we look back at our Goomba example, once you kill the Goomba, there's absolutely nothing on screen for a few seconds, which means the player doesn't really have anything to look forward to. Keeping the player either avoiding or thinking about obstacles will stop them from being bored during levels like this. On-Off Rail Switch here also uses the titular on-off switches to make the level a bit more interesting as well, giving the player control over how they move along with what obstacles they'll have to go through. That means whenever a switch is on screen, the player has to think about whether to hit it or not, once again adding another layer to this level and keeping it engaging. That's not to say there shouldn't be downtime in your level though. Throwing obstacles at your player too rapidly could easily overwhelm them. Sure, sometimes that's the point if you're making a Kaizo or something, but for a more general traditional level, having some time to rest isn't a bad idea to include. You'll notice that many levels that don't auto-scroll have plenty of downtime. The difference is though, the downtime in a normal level can be ran through if somebody just wants to keep the level going, but in an auto-scroller, the player has to sit through these downtime segments, which can feel a bit tedious. My suggestion to make the small breaks between challenges more interesting is to give the player something to do. We talked about this earlier when dealing with the P-switch timer, and that absolutely applies to auto-scrollers too. Giving them a lot of coins to run around and collect can keep the player occupied for when the screen finally reaches their next challenge. Moving platform levels have a much easier time when it comes to giving the player a break, as you could just simply have the player jump off the platform to start again whenever they want. So while yes, you do want to keep the player occupied with obstacles throughout the level, having some downtime so as to not make them too stressed out is also a smart idea as well. Keeping the player always focused on something other than the auto-scroll itself will help keep the level feeling enjoyable, whether it be obstacles or extras like coins. Now I do want to give another example of a level that does this concept well, however we've already talked a lot about the Mario series today, probably because this is a Mario Maker video, but I wanted to take an example from a franchise that I think does the concept of waiting justice, and that franchise is... I think the Five Nights at Freddy's series is one of the best quote-unquote auto-scrolling series there is. If you somehow never played or heard of this series, for the first few entries you have to survive your job as a night guard from 12 AM to 6 AM. This sets each night on a timer, so you can essentially think of this as a survival room stretched out to be the length of an entire game. With that being said, how do they make waiting fun for this long? Five Nights at Freddy's nights are generally much longer than any auto-scroller in Mario Maker, so the fact that they can remain interesting throughout the entire time is definitely commendable. The way that these games do do that is by constantly keeping the player on their toes. Now, a large portion of that does have to do with randomness, which isn't something easily replicable in Mario Maker, but there are still some things that we can take from these games. My personal favorite gameplay-wise is Five Nights at Freddy's 2, in which you have 11 main animatronics you have to worry about during any given night. To avoid most of these, you have to wear the Freddy mask once they get near your office. Think of them as the sort of standard enemies. Foxy and the Puppet act a bit differently as they remain constant threats throughout the entire night. You have to either flash the lights or wind the music box to keep them away, which gives you something to do while no animatronic is directly attacking you. I know that's a very basic description of the gameplay loop in this game, and I do want to go more in depth with it in a future video, but for the purposes of this one, that's pretty much what you need to know. There's never a point in the night where you should be doing nothing, and that's exactly what I think the best auto-scroller moving platform levels have in common. Whether you're having the player dodge saws, hitting a question mark block, or even collecting pink coins, there shouldn't be a moment in your level where the player has nothing to do, because once they reach that point, they'll start to get bored of your level pretty quickly. But anyways, that's it for this video. Are you all incorrect and think Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is the best in the series? Let me know in the comments. Like I said, this is my first tips and tricks video in a really long time, so I hope you all enjoyed it. I thought using examples from other games and levels this time around would be interesting, so I hope you all like this approach to the series. If you all do like how I did this episode, I may do others like this in the future. But anyways, dry bones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.